The sun was setting over Fallujah when Marine Corporal Sarah Martinez felt the world explode around her. The convoy had been moving through the narrow streets when the improvised explosive device detonated just meters from her Humvee. The blast threw her vehicle sideways, slamming it against a concrete barrier with bone-crushing force. Sarah's ears were ringing so loudly she couldn't hear her own screams. Smoke filled the air, thick and black, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. She tried to move, but felt a sharp, burning pain shoot through her left leg. Looking down, she saw blood seeping through her combat uniform. Dark red stains spreading across the desert camouflage fabric. Her squad leader, Sergeant Rodriguez, was slumped over the steering wheel. Unconscious but breathing, the radio crackled with frantic voices calling for backup. But the words seemed to come from far away, like voices in a dream. Sarah reached for her rifle, her training kicking in despite the pain that was now spreading through her entire body. The attack had come from nowhere. Intelligence reports had suggested this route was relatively safe, but the insurgents had been watching, waiting for the perfect moment. Sarah's unit was part of a humanitarian mission, delivering medical supplies to a local clinic that treated both Iraqi civilians and wounded soldiers. Now those same supplies were scattered across the street, mixing with debris and broken glass. As Sarah tried to radio for help, she noticed movement in the shadows of nearby buildings. Figures in dark clothing were positioning themselves on rooftops and behind corners. Her heart raced as she realized they were surrounded. The attack wasn't over. It was just beginning. Private Johnson, who had been riding in the back seat, was now conscious and trying to help Rodriguez. Sarah could see that Johnson's arm was hanging at an odd angle, clearly broken, but he was still trying to function as a soldier. The young Marine's face was pale with shock, but his eyes showed determination. Sarah managed to get on the radio and call for immediate evacuation. The response came back crackling through static. The nearest support was at least 30 minutes away, maybe longer depending on the situation on the ground. 30 minutes felt like a lifetime when you could already hear the sound of approaching footsteps and muffled voices speaking in Arabic. The insurgents were getting closer. Sarah could make out at least 6 different positions where muzzle flashes had appeared. They were being systematically surrounded, cut off from any escape route. The twisted metal of their Humvee provided some cover, but it wouldn't last long against sustained gunfire. Rodriguez finally came to, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. He immediately assessed the situation, his years of experience taking over despite his injuries. Without saying a word, he began setting up a defensive position using whatever cover they could find. The 3 Marines worked together, checking their ammunition and preparing for what they all knew was coming. The first shots rang out just as darkness began to fall over the city. Bullets ricocheted off the armored vehicle, sending sparks flying in all directions. Sarah returned fire, trying to keep the attackers at bay while Rodriguez worked the radio, desperately calling for air support or any available backup units in the area. Time seemed to slow down as the firefight intensified. Sarah's leg was getting worse, the bleeding heavier, but she pushed through the pain. She had to. Her fellow Marines were counting on her, and she wasn't about to let them down. Each shot she fired was calculated, conserving ammunition while trying to keep the enemy from advancing. Johnson, despite his broken arm, was doing his best to help by spotting targets and managing their limited medical supplies. He had torn strips from his uniform to use as bandages, applying pressure to Sarah's leg wound whenever there was a brief lull in the fighting. As the night wore on, the situation became increasingly desperate. Their ammunition was running low and Sarah's condition was deteriorating. The blood loss was making her dizzy, and she was having trouble focusing. Rodriguez kept checking on her, knowing that if she lost consciousness, their chances of survival would drop significantly. The insurgents seemed to have unlimited patience. They would fire in controlled bursts, then disappear back into the shadows, only to emerge from a different position minutes later. It was clear they knew the area well and were using the urban terrain to their advantage. Around midnight, Sarah collapsed. The combination of blood loss and exhaustion had finally overcome her adrenaline. Rodriguez and Johnson did their best to keep her conscious, talking to her constantly and applying pressure to her wounds. They all knew that medical evacuation was their only hope now. The radio remained mostly silent except for occasional status checks from command. Other units were engaged in heavy fighting across the city, and resources were stretched thin. Sarah's team was essentially on their own. 3 wounded Marines against an unknown number of well-positioned insurgents. Rodriguez made the difficult decision to break radio silence and transmit their exact coordinates, along with a detailed assessment of their situation. It was a risk because it could give away their position to anyone monitoring radio traffic. But they were running out of options. Sarah needed immediate medical attention, and they needed extraction before their ammunition ran out completely. The response that came back would change everything. A voice Sarah didn't recognize came through the static, calm and professional. "Hold your position. Help is coming. Stay alive." It was brief, but something about the tone gave all 3 Marines a glimmer of hope they hadn't felt since the attack began. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness as the first night stretched into dawn. Every time she opened her eyes, Rodriguez was there, checking her pulse and making sure the makeshift bandages were still holding. The bleeding had slowed but hadn't stopped completely. Her combat uniform was now more red than green, and the metallic smell of blood mixed with the acrid smoke that still lingered in the air. The insurgents had pulled back before sunrise, but everyone knew they were still out there watching and waiting. Johnson had managed to find a working radio in the wreckage of another vehicle that had been hit in the initial blast. The communications were sporadic, but they learned that several other Marine units were also pinned down across Fallujah. The entire city had erupted in coordinated attacks. Rodriguez used the brief calm to do a more thorough assessment of their situation. They had enough water for maybe 2 more days if they were careful. Food wasn't really a concern at this point, but ammunition definitely was. Between the 3 of them, they had fewer than 60 rounds left. That wasn't much if the insurgents decided to mount a serious assault. Sarah's condition was the biggest worry. The leg wound was serious, but there was also concern about internal injuries from the blast. She was showing signs of shock and her breathing had become shallow and rapid. Rodriguez had seen enough combat casualties to know that time was running out. Without proper medical treatment, Sarah wouldn't survive another night. As the morning progressed, the sound of gunfire echoed through the streets around them. Other Marine units were engaged in heavy fighting, and the insurgents seemed to be everywhere. Rodriguez tried repeatedly to raise command on the radio, but the responses were always the same. Hold position. Reinforcements were being organized. Medical evacuation was being coordinated. Johnson, despite his broken arm, had become their lookout. He positioned himself where he could watch the approaches to their position while still staying in cover. His arm was causing him significant pain, but he never complained. The young Marine understood that their survival depended on everyone doing their job, regardless of their injuries. Around midday, Sarah became delirious. She started talking about her hometown in Texas, describing the smell of her mother's cooking and the sound of her little brother playing in the backyard. Rodriguez encouraged her to keep talking, knowing that keeping her conscious was crucial. He had her describe every detail she could remember about home, using the memories to anchor her to consciousness. The heat was becoming unbearable. The twisted metal of their vehicle absorbed the desert sun, turning their makeshift shelter into an oven. They had to ration their water carefully, but Sarah needed more fluids than they could spare. Rodriguez made the difficult decision to give Sarah most of their remaining water, knowing it might mean the difference between life and death for her. Johnson spotted movement in the afternoon. Insurgents were testing their defenses, appearing briefly at windows and behind corners, trying to determine if the Marines were still combat effective. Rodriguez decided they needed to show strength, so he had Johnson fire a few carefully aimed shots at the suspected positions. The message was clear. They were still alive and still dangerous. The psychological warfare was taking its toll. The insurgents would occasionally shout threats in broken English, describing what they would do when they captured the Americans. Rodriguez ordered Johnson to ignore the taunts, but he could see the stress building in the young Marine's face. The combination of pain, exhaustion, and fear was wearing down their defenses. As evening approached, Sarah's breathing became more labored. Rodriguez checked her pulse and found it weak and irregular. He had seen enough wounded Marines to know what these signs meant. They were running out of time and still no sign of the help that had been promised on the radio. The radio crackled to life just as the sun was setting. A different voice this time, speaking in calm, measured tones. "Marine unit at grid coordinates 235-847, this is Navy Special Operations. We have your position. Continue to hold. Do not break cover. Help is closer than you think. Rodriguez felt a surge of hope. Navy Special Operations could only mean one thing: SEALs. If they were involved, it meant someone with real authority had made the decision to extract them, regardless of the tactical situation. SEALs didn't get sent on routine missions. The voice on the radio continued with specific instructions. We need you to mark your position with an infrared strobe at exactly 2200 hours. Flash it 3 times, then wait for our signal. Do not use the strobe at any other time. Enemy forces are monitoring the area. Rodriguez checked his watch. It was 7:30 p.m. They had 2.5 hours to keep Sarah alive and maintain their defensive position. Johnson was visibly relieved by the news, but Rodriguez remained cautious. He had been in enough combat situations to know that plans could change quickly, and there were no guarantees in a firefight. Sarah seemed to sense that something was happening. Her eyes opened and focused on Rodriguez with more clarity than she had shown all day. "Are they coming?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant sound of gunfire from other parts of the city. "Yes," Rodriguez told her firmly. "They're coming. You just need to hold on a little longer. Can you do that for me?" Sarah nodded weakly, but Rodriguez could see she was struggling. Every breath seemed to require enormous effort, and her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that concerned him deeply. He began talking to her again, this time about the SEALs who were coming to get them. He told her about their training, their reputation for never leaving anyone behind, and their ability to operate in impossible situations. He painted a picture of professional warriors who specialized in exactly this type of rescue mission. Whether any of it was entirely accurate didn't matter. What mattered was giving Sarah something to focus on, a reason to keep fighting. The insurgents seemed to sense that something was changing. As darkness fell, the probing attacks became more frequent and more aggressive. Rodriguez and Johnson found themselves in several brief firefights, carefully managing their remaining ammunition while trying to keep the enemy at bay. At 10:00 p.m. exactly, Rodriguez activated the infrared strobe, flashing it 3 times toward the sky as instructed. The device was invisible to the naked eye, but would be clearly visible to anyone using night vision equipment. Within seconds, a voice came through the radio. "We see you. Stay down. This is going to get loud." The explosion came without warning, a massive blast that lit up the night sky and shook the ground beneath them. Rodriguez instinctively covered Sarah's body with his own, as debris rained down around their position. The sound was deafening, far louder than anything they had experienced during the previous 2 days of fighting. Through the ringing in his ears, Rodriguez could hear the distinct crack of high-powered rifles firing in precise, controlled bursts. These weren't the wild automatic weapons fire they had grown accustomed to from the insurgents. This was something different, professional, calculated, and devastatingly effective. Johnson was pointing toward a building about 200 meters away where muzzle flashes had been visible throughout the day. Now there was only silence and darkness. Whatever the SEALs had used to clear that position had been both swift and complete. Rodriguez began to understand why these special operations teams had such fearsome reputations. "Marine Unit, this is Bravo Team," came the voice over the radio. "We are moving to your position. Do not engage any targets. Repeat, hold your fire and stay in cover. We have multiple teams in the area." Rodriguez acknowledged the transmission and passed the word to Johnson. The young Marine looked both relieved and amazed as the sounds of coordinated combat moved through the streets around them. Explosions echoed off the concrete buildings, but they were controlled detonations, clearly part of a planned assault rather than random violence. Sarah's eyes fluttered open at the sound of the explosions. For a moment she seemed confused, unsure if this was another attack or something else entirely. Rodriguez leaned close to her ear and explained what was happening. "The cavalry has arrived," he told her with a grin. "Navy SEALs. They're clearing the area." The fighting lasted less than 20 minutes, but it was the most intense 20 minutes Rodriguez had ever witnessed. The SEALs moved through the urban terrain like ghosts, appearing and disappearing with surgical precision. Each engagement was brief and decisive. There were no prolonged firefights, no back-and-forth exchanges of gunfire. The insurgents were being systematically eliminated or driven from their positions. A new voice came over the radio, calm and professional despite the chaos happening around them. "Marine Unit, we have multiple wounded insurgents attempting to escape to the north. They are no longer a threat to your position. Medical team is 2 minutes out. Rodriguez found himself holding his breath. 2 minutes felt like an eternity when you had been trapped for almost 48 hours. But it also felt impossibly fast. After 2 days of fighting for survival, the idea that rescue was actually happening seemed almost too good to be true. Johnson was the first to spot them. 3 figures in full combat gear moving low and fast through the shadows, their movements coordinated and purposeful. They approached from the direction that had been cleared first, using hand signals to communicate with each other as they covered the final distance to the Marine's position. The lead SEAL appeared at Rodriguez's shoulder without making a sound. One moment Rodriguez was watching the approach route, and the next moment, there was a fully armed warrior kneeling beside him, conducting a rapid assessment of the situation. "I'm Chief Petty Officer Williams," the SEAL said quietly. "How many wounded?" Rodriguez quickly briefed him on Sarah's condition and Johnson's broken arm. Williams immediately called for his medic, while the other 2 SEALs established a security perimeter around their position. The efficiency was remarkable. Within seconds, they had transformed the chaotic battlefield into an organized medical evacuation site. The SEAL medic, a compact man with gentle hands and serious eyes, immediately began working on Sarah. He had brought real medical equipment, IV bags, proper bandages, and drugs that could help with both pain and blood loss. Rodriguez watched with fascination as the medic worked, his movements quick but deliberate. "She's lost a lot of blood," the medic reported to Williams, "but her vitals are stable. We can move her, but we need to do it now." Williams nodded and spoke into his radio. "Bravo 6, this is Bravo 1. We have 3 wounded Marines ready for extraction. Request immediate medical evacuation to the base hospital." The response came back immediately. "Bravo 1, medical chopper is inbound. Landing zone secured. ETA 4 minutes, 4 minutes. Rodriguez couldn't believe how quickly everything was happening. After 2 days of waiting and fighting, the rescue was being executed with clockwork precision. He watched as the SEALs prepared Sarah for transport, securing her to a lightweight stretcher that seemed to appear from nowhere. Johnson's arm was quickly splinted and put in a proper sling. The young Marine was staring at the SEALs with obvious admiration, clearly impressed by their professionalism and equipment. One of the SEALs noticed his expression and gave him a reassuring nod. "You guys did good," the SEAL told Johnson. "Holding this position for 2 days with limited ammunition and wounded personnel is no small thing. Your training paid off." Rodriguez felt a surge of pride at the recognition, but his attention was focused on Sarah. The SEAL medic had started an IV and was monitoring her blood pressure. Her color was already looking better and her breathing seemed less labored. Professional medical care was making a difference. The sound of helicopter rotors filled the air, growing louder as the aircraft approached their position. Williams spoke into his radio again, coordinating with the pilot to ensure a safe landing in the middle of what had been an active combat zone just minutes earlier. "The landing zone is 2 blocks north," Williams told Rodriguez. "We're going to move as a unit. My team will provide security while you carry your wounded. The chopper will be on the ground for less than 2 minutes, so we need to move fast." Rodriguez nodded his understanding. After 2 days of careful defensive movements, the idea of moving quickly through open streets seemed almost foreign. But with the SEALs providing security, he felt confident they could reach the helicopter safely. As they prepared to move, Sarah grabbed Rodriguez's hand. Her grip was weak, but her eyes were clear. "Thank you," she whispered. "For keeping me alive." Rodriguez squeezed her hand gently. "That's what Marines do," he told her. "We take care of each other." Williams gave the signal to move. The SEALs took point and rearguard positions while Rodriguez and Johnson helped carry Sarah's stretcher. Despite everything they had been through, Rodriguez found himself moving with renewed energy. The nightmare was finally coming to an end. The helicopter was already on the ground when they reached the landing zone, its rotors spinning and engines running. Medical personnel rushed forward to take Sarah's stretcher, their movements quick and professional. Johnson climbed aboard under his own power, and Rodriguez followed, taking one last look at the city where they had fought for their lives. As the helicopter lifted off, Rodriguez could see the SEALs already melting back into the shadows, probably moving to their next mission. They had appeared, completed their objective with devastating efficiency, and disappeared again. It was exactly what he had expected from Navy Special Operations. The helicopter ride to the base hospital took 12 minutes, but it felt like seconds to Rodriguez. He watched the SEAL medic work on Sarah during the flight, adjusting her IV and monitoring her vital signs with equipment he had never seen before. The man's hands were steady despite the vibration and movement of the aircraft. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness during the flight, but when her eyes were open, they were clearer than they had been in hours. The professional medical care was already making a dramatic difference. Her skin color was improving and her breathing was becoming more regular with each passing minute. Johnson sat quietly in his seat, cradling his splinted arm and staring out the helicopter's window at the city lights below. The young Marine looked exhausted but relieved. Rodriguez could see him processing everything that had happened over the past 2 days, trying to make sense of how they had survived when so many things had gone wrong. The base hospital was a hub of activity when they landed. Medical teams were waiting with gurneys and equipment, ready to take over Sarah's care the moment the helicopter touched down. Rodriguez watched as they transferred her from the SEAL medic's care to the hospital staff, noting how seamlessly the handoff occurred. A Navy doctor immediately began examining Sarah, while nurses started additional IVs and connected monitoring equipment. Rodriguez tried to stay close, but hospital staff gently but firmly moved him aside so they could work. Within minutes, Sarah was being wheeled into surgery to repair the damage from her leg wound and check for internal injuries. Rodriguez and Johnson were taken to a different part of the hospital for their own medical evaluations. A young Navy corpsman cleaned and dressed Rodriguez's minor cuts and scrapes, while a doctor examined Johnson's broken arm more thoroughly. The medical staff was professional and efficient, but Rodriguez could tell they were curious about what had happened. "You guys were out there for 2 full days?" the corpsman asked Rodriguez while applying antiseptic to a cut on his forehead. "That's a long time to hold a position with limited support." Rodriguez nodded but didn't elaborate. He was still processing everything himself, and part of him felt like talking about it might somehow make it less real. The transition from combat to safety had happened so quickly that his mind was struggling to catch up. After their medical examinations, Rodriguez and Johnson were taken to a debriefing room where intelligence officers were waiting to hear their account of what had happened. The questions were detailed and specific. How many insurgents had they observed? What types of weapons were being used? How organized did the attack seem? What was the condition of the civilian population in that area? Rodriguez answered the questions as thoroughly as he could, but his mind kept drifting to Sarah and how she was doing in surgery. The intelligence officers seemed to understand his distraction and kept the debriefing relatively brief. They assured him that they could conduct more detailed interviews later if necessary. "The SEALs who extracted you filed their own report," one of the officers told Rodriguez. "According to their assessment, you and your team performed exceptionally well under extremely difficult circumstances. That's going into your official record." After the debriefing, Rodriguez was finally able to check on Sarah's condition. The surgeon, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, met with him in a small consultation room near the operating theater. Her news was cautiously optimistic. The leg wound was serious but clean, she explained. No major arteries were severed, and there's no permanent damage to the bone or major muscle groups. She lost a significant amount of blood, but we've got that stabilized now. The bigger concern was potential internal bleeding from the blast trauma, but our scans didn't show anything worrying. Rodriguez felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. "So she's going to be okay?" "She's going to need several weeks of recovery time, and there will be physical therapy for the leg," the surgeon continued. "But yes, she should make a full recovery. If you hadn't applied pressure to that wound and kept her conscious for as long as you did, the outcome might have been very different." The surgeon's words hit Rodriguez harder than he expected. For 2 days, he had been focused entirely on immediate survival, making decisions based on training and instinct. Only now was he beginning to understand how close they had all come to not making it out alive. Johnson appeared in the doorway of the consultation room, his arm now in a proper cast and sling. The young Marine looked much better after a shower, a hot meal, and some pain medication for his arm. His eyes lit up when he heard the positive news about Sarah's condition. "Can we see her?" Johnson asked. The surgeon nodded. "She's in recovery now, still under anesthesia, but you can look in on her for a few minutes. She'll probably be awake in a couple of hours." They followed the surgeon down a hallway lined with rooms full of wounded soldiers from various units. The hospital was busy. a reminder that their firefight had been just one of many happening across the region. Rodriguez noticed that most of the patients seemed to be in good spirits despite their injuries, talking and joking with medical staff and visiting comrades. Sarah looked small and vulnerable in the hospital bed, connected to various monitors and IV lines, but her color was good, and the steady beeping of the heart monitor was reassuring. Rodriguez stood beside her bed for several minutes, watching her sleep and thinking about how different this moment might have been. A nurse appeared and quietly adjusted one of Sarah's IV bags. "She's doing very well," she told Rodriguez softly. "Her vital signs are stable, and the surgeon expects her to wake up within the next hour or two. You're welcome to stay if you'd like." Rodriguez decided to stay. Johnson pulled up a second chair, and the two Marines settled in to wait for their teammate to wake up. The room was quiet except for the soft sounds of medical equipment and the distant murmur of hospital activity in the corridor. As they sat there, Rodriguez began to think about the SEALs who had rescued them. The entire operation had been executed with a level of precision and professionalism that was both impressive and humbling. From the initial radio contact to the final helicopter extraction, every element had been carefully planned and flawlessly executed. "Those SEALs were something else," Johnson said quietly, echoing Rodriguez's thoughts. The way they moved, the way they communicated. It was like watching a completely different kind of warfare. Rodriguez nodded. He had always respected special operations forces, but seeing them work firsthand had given him a new appreciation for their capabilities. The contrast between the chaotic, desperate fighting of the previous 2 days and the controlled, systematic way the SEALs had neutralized the threat was remarkable. Sarah's eyes fluttered open just as the sun was beginning to rise outside the hospital window. She looked confused for a moment, trying to focus on her surroundings, but then she saw Rodriguez and Johnson sitting beside her bed and managed a weak smile. "We made it," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the anesthesia. "We made it," Rodriguez confirmed, reaching over to squeeze her hand gently. "Thanks to some very professional Navy SEALs who decided we were worth the trouble." Sarah nodded slowly, still processing where she was and what had happened. "How long was I out?" "About 6 hours for the surgery," Johnson told her. "But before that, you were in and out for most of the second day. You probably don't remember much of it." Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking. "I remember the explosions when they came for us, and I remember thinking that help had finally arrived." She looked at Rodriguez with gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Rodriguez felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Marines don't leave Marines behind," he said simply. "That's not how we do things." 3 days after the rescue, Rodriguez received an unexpected visitor at the base hospital. Chief Petty Officer Williams, the SEAL team leader who had led their extraction, appeared in the doorway of the small recreation room where Rodriguez was reading. The special operations warrior looked different out of combat gear. Smaller somehow, but his eyes held the same intensity Rodriguez remembered from that night in Fallujah. "Mind if I sit down?" Williams asked, gesturing to an empty chair across from Rodriguez. "Of course not," Rodriguez replied, setting aside his book. "I wanted to thank you for what your team did for us. We wouldn't have made it out without you." Williams waved off the thanks with a modest gesture. "That's what we do. But I wanted to talk to you about how you handled those 2 days before we arrived. My team reviewed the situation pretty thoroughly and we were impressed." Rodriguez felt uncomfortable with the praise. "We just did what we were trained to do. Tried to stay alive and keep our people together." "It was more than that," Williams insisted. "You made smart tactical decisions with limited resources. You kept your wounded alive under extremely difficult circumstances, and you maintained discipline and focus when a lot of people would have panicked." The SEAL pulled out a small notebook and flipped through several pages. "According to our intelligence assessment, you were facing at least 12 insurgents in fortified positions. They had you surrounded and outgunned, but you held them off for 48 hours with minimal ammunition and serious casualties." Rodriguez thought about Johnson's broken arm and Sarah's deteriorating condition during those long hours. "We almost didn't make it. If you guys had been even a few hours later—" "But we weren't," Williams interrupted, "and part of the reason we were able to extract you successfully was because you had maintained such good defensive discipline. When we arrived, we knew exactly where you were. We knew your condition, and we knew the enemy positions because you had been providing accurate intelligence reports." The conversation was interrupted by Johnson, who appeared in the doorway with his arm still in a cast but looking much healthier than he had 3 days earlier. Williams stood and shook the young Marine's good hand, asking about his recovery and making casual conversation that put Johnson at ease. "I was just telling Sergeant Rodriguez here that you guys handled yourselves like professionals out there," Williams said. Not everyone would have kept their heads in that situation. Johnson looked pleased but embarrassed by the compliment. "Sergeant Rodriguez kept us focused," he said. "And we all knew we had to keep Corporal Martinez alive. That gave us something to fight for." Sarah appeared a few minutes later, moving slowly on crutches but looking remarkably better than she had in the hospital bed. The reunion was emotional, with handshakes and careful hugs as the 3 Marines came together for the first time since the helicopter extraction. Williams watched the interaction with obvious approval. "This is what we train for," he told them. "Not just the tactical skills, but the bonds between team members that keep people alive when everything goes wrong." The SEAL explained that his team had been monitoring the situation in Fallujah for several hours before they received the order to extract the trapped Marines. "We were actually positioned about 2 kilometers away waiting for orders when your situation became critical. The decision to move in came from pretty high up the command structure." "How high?" Rodriguez asked. "High enough that it bypassed normal operational protocols," Williams replied with a slight smile. "Someone with stars on their collar decided that leaving Marines behind wasn't an option, regardless of the tactical complications." Sarah settled into a chair, propping her injured leg up on a small stool. "What happened to the insurgents who were holding us down?" Williams's expression became more serious. "Most of them were eliminated during the extraction. A few escaped to the north, but they ran into another Marine unit about an hour later. The entire cell that was operating in that sector has been neutralized." The room fell quiet as the 3 Marines processed this information. The people who had tried to kill them, who had kept them trapped and wounded for 2 days, were no longer a threat to anyone else. "The intelligence you provided during those 2 days was valuable," Williams continued. "The radio reports you sent back helped us understand the enemy's tactics and positioning. That information has been shared with other units operating in the area." Johnson looked thoughtful. "So something good came out of all that?" "Definitely," Williams confirmed. "Your experience helped save other lives. The tactical information you gathered is being used to better protect supply convoys and humanitarian missions throughout the region." Rodriguez felt a sense of closure that he hadn't expected. Knowing that their ordeal had contributed to protecting other Marines made the suffering feel more meaningful somehow. Williams stood to leave but paused at the door. "There's one more thing," he said. "Your actions during those 2 days are being written up for commendations. I wanted you to know that before it becomes official." After the SEAL left, the 3 Marines sat together in comfortable silence for a while. The recreational room had large windows that looked out over the base, where they could see other Marines going about their daily routines, attending meetings, conducting training, and preparing for missions. "It feels strange being back," Sarah said finally. 2 weeks ago, this all seemed normal. Now everything feels different." Rodriguez understood what she meant. The experience had changed their perspective on things that had once seemed routine. Simple pleasures like hot meals, clean clothes, and safe sleeping quarters now felt like luxuries rather than basic expectations. "I keep thinking about those SEALs," Johnson said. "The way they moved, the way they handled the whole situation. It made me realize how much more there is to learn about being a warrior." Sarah nodded in agreement. "They made it look easy, but you could tell they had trained for years to develop that level of skill. Every movement was deliberate. Every decision was calculated." Rodriguez thought about the contrast between their desperate struggle for survival and the SEALs' methodical, professional approach to the same tactical situation. "Maybe that's the difference between surviving and thriving in combat," he mused. "We were reacting to events, but they were controlling them." The conversation turned to their plans for recovery and return to duty. Sarah would need several more weeks of physical therapy before she could return to active status. Johnson's arm would be in a cast for at least 6 weeks, but he could perform limited duties in the meantime. Rodriguez had been cleared for full duty, but was being given additional time off to recover from the psychological stress of the extended combat. "I want to come back stronger," Sarah said with determination. "This experience showed me things about myself that I didn't know before." "I want to build on that," Johnson agreed. "I learned that I can function under pressure even when I'm hurt and scared." but I also learned how much I have to learn." Rodriguez looked at his two teammates with pride and affection. They had been through something that would have broken many people, but they were talking about becoming better Marines because of it. That resilience, that commitment to growth and improvement was what made the Corps special. As evening approached, they made plans to meet for dinner in the hospital cafeteria. It would be their first real meal together since before the attack, and somehow that felt significant. They were no longer just three Marines who happened to be assigned to the same unit. They were now bonded by shared experience in a way that would last for the rest of their lives. Walking back to their rooms, Rodriguez reflected on Chief Williams' visit and his words about the bonds between team members. The SEAL had been right. Their survival had depended not just on individual training and courage, but on their commitment to each other. When Sarah was wounded and losing blood, it wasn't just medical training that kept her alive. It was the determination of her fellow Marines to never give up on her. That evening, as they shared dinner in the hospital cafeteria, Rodriguez noticed how other Marines looked at them. Word had spread about their ordeal and rescue, and there was a mixture of respect and curiosity in the glances they received. Some came over to ask questions or simply to express their admiration for how the team had handled themselves. A young private approached their table nervously, clearly wanting to say something but unsure how to begin. Sarah noticed his hesitation and invited him to sit down. The private explained that he was scheduled to deploy to Fallujah in 2 weeks and wanted to know what to expect. Instead of frightening him with tales of combat and danger, the three Marines found themselves sharing practical advice about staying alert, trusting your training, and looking out for your team members. They talked about the importance of communication, the value of maintaining equipment, and the need to stay mentally flexible when situations changed rapidly. "The most important thing," Rodriguez told the young private, "is to remember that you're not out there alone. Your team members are depending on you, and you're depending on them. That connection, that mutual responsibility is what gets you through the difficult times." The private listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and taking mental notes. When he finally left their table, he seemed more confident and better prepared for what lay ahead. The three Marines realized that sharing their experience had been helpful not just for the young private, but for their own processing of what had happened. Later that night, Rodriguez lay in his hospital bed thinking about the full circle of their experience. They had started as individual Marines assigned to a routine mission. The crisis had forged them into a tight-knit team focused entirely on survival and mutual support. The rescue had shown them what was possible when highly trained professionals worked together with perfect coordination, and now they were passing on what they had learned to the next generation of Marines. He thought about Chief Williams and the SEAL team that had extracted them. Those warriors had probably already moved on to other missions, other rescues, other life and death situations. For them, saving 3 trapped Marines was just another day's work. But for Rodriguez, Johnson, and Sarah, it was the defining moment of their military careers. The experience had taught them that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the ability to function effectively despite fear. They had learned that training mattered, but that adaptability and quick thinking were equally important. Most importantly, they had discovered that the bonds between Marines could literally mean the difference between life and death. As Rodriguez drifted off to sleep, he felt grateful not just for their survival, but for the opportunity to serve alongside people like Johnson and Sarah. The Corps had always talked about brotherhood and loyalty, but now those concepts had real meaning based on shared experience. They had faced the worst together and come through it stronger than before. 6 months later, Rodriguez stood in the formation as Sarah received the Navy Cross for her actions during those 2 days in Fallujah. The ceremony was held at the main base theater, with several hundred Marines in attendance. Sarah walked to the podium without her crutches, her leg having healed completely after months of physical therapy and determination. The citation read by the commanding general detailed how Corporal Martinez had continued to fight effectively despite serious wounds, maintained communication with command headquarters under enemy fire, and provided crucial intelligence that contributed to the successful neutralization of an insurgent cell. But Rodriguez knew the words on the official document couldn't capture the reality of what had happened. Johnson, now promoted to corporal, received the Bronze Star with Combat V for his actions in maintaining defensive positions while wounded and providing medical aid to his fellow Marines. His broken arm had healed properly, and he had returned to full combat duty 2 months earlier. The young Marine had grown considerably since their ordeal, displaying a confidence and maturity that impressed his new team members. Rodriguez's own Silver Star citation mentioned his leadership under fire and his success in keeping his team alive against overwhelming odds. As he listened to the words being read, Rodriguez thought about how inadequate they seemed to describe the complex emotions and split-second decisions that had defined those 48 hours. After the ceremony, the 3 Marines were approached by Chief Petty Officer Williams, who had traveled from his base to attend the awards presentation. The SEAL looked genuinely pleased to see how well they had all recovered and adapted to their experiences. "I told you that night that help was coming," Williams said with a smile. "But the truth is you had already saved yourselves by the time we arrived. We just provided transportation out of there." Sarah shook her head. "We wouldn't have lasted another hour without your team. The insurgents were getting ready for a final assault when you hit them." "Maybe," Williams conceded. "But the point is that you were still fighting, still organized, still thinking tactically after 2 days of combat. That's not common, even among experienced units." The SEAL explained that their extraction had become a case study at the Special Operations Command, used to train other teams on urban rescue operations. The tactical situation, the coordination between trapped personnel and rescue forces, and the successful outcome had made it a textbook example of how such missions should be conducted. "Your after-action reports were detailed and accurate," Williams told them. "The intelligence you provided about enemy tactics and positioning has been incorporated into training materials for Marines deploying to similar environments." Rodriguez felt a sense of pride knowing that their experience was helping to prepare other Marines for the challenges they might face. The suffering and fear they had endured had been transformed into knowledge that could save lives in the future. The conversation was interrupted by a young lieutenant who approached nervously, clearly wanting to speak with the 3 Marines. Sarah recognized the expression immediately. It was the same look they had seen from that private in the hospital cafeteria months earlier. "Excuse me," the lieutenant said. "I'm deploying to Iraq next month, and I was wondering if I could ask you some questions about urban combat situations." The 3 Marines exchanged glances and nodded. Over the months since their recovery, they had become informal mentors to dozens of Marines preparing for deployment. Word had spread that they were willing to share practical advice based on real experience, and they found themselves regularly approached by younger Marines seeking guidance. They found a quiet corner of the reception area where they could talk without being overheard. The lieutenant's questions were thoughtful and specific. "How do you maintain communication when radio equipment is damaged? What's the best way to treat serious wounds with limited medical supplies? How do you keep morale up when the situation seems hopeless?" Rodriguez answered the technical questions while Johnson shared insights about staying mentally focused under pressure. Sarah talked about the importance of trusting your training even when everything seems to be going wrong. Together, they painted a realistic picture of combat that was neither overly frightening nor falsely reassuring. "The most important thing to remember," Sarah told the lieutenant, "is that no situation is completely hopeless as long as you and your team members are still breathing and thinking. There's always something you can do, some way to improve your position or help your people." The lieutenant listened carefully, asking follow-up questions and clearly trying to absorb as much information as possible. When he finally thanked them and moved away, Rodriguez noticed that he seemed more confident and better prepared for the challenges ahead. Later that evening, the 3 Marines had dinner together at a restaurant in town. It had become a monthly tradition, a way to stay connected and maintain the bonds that had been forged during their ordeal. The conversations during these meals ranged from serious discussions about military tactics to lighthearted jokes about hospital food and physical therapy. "I've been thinking about Chief Williams's comment about us saving ourselves," Johnson said over dessert. "Do you think that's true?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I think we saved each other," she said finally. "None of us would have made it out alone, but together we found ways to survive and keep fighting." Rodriguez nodded in agreement. The SEALs provided the extraction, but they were right that we had already done the hardest part. We had refused to give up, and we had kept the team together despite everything that was working against us. The conversation turned to their current assignments and future plans. Sarah had been accepted for advanced leadership training and was considering making the Marine Corps a career. Johnson was planning to apply for reconnaissance training, inspired by his interaction with the SEAL team. Rodriguez had been offered a position as an instructor at the basic infantry school, where he could share his combat experience with new Marines. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Sarah raised her glass in a toast. "To the SEALs who came for us," she said, "and to Marines who never leave Marines behind." They clinked glasses and drank, each lost in their own memories of that night when the sound of explosions had meant rescue instead of danger. The experience had changed all of them in fundamental ways, but it had also reinforced their faith in the Corps and in each other. Walking to their cars in the parking lot, Rodriguez reflected on how different their lives might have been if the outcome in Fallujah had been different. They had all come close to not making it out, but they had survived because of training, determination, and mutual support. Now they were using those same qualities to help prepare the next generation of Marines for similar challenges. The story that had begun with an explosion and blood in the streets of Fallujah had become something larger, a testament to the power of teamwork, the importance of never giving up, and the reality that sometimes help comes exactly when you need it most. For Rodriguez, Johnson, and Sarah, it would always be the defining moment of their military service, the experience that taught them what it truly meant to be Marines. As they drove away in separate directions, each heading back to their own base and their own responsibilities, they carried with them the knowledge that they had faced the worst together and emerged stronger because of it. The bonds forged in combat would last for the rest of their lives, a reminder that some connections transcend ordinary friendship and become something approaching family.